Well, I did it. I wasn't going to do it. I was going to say no this time. I was going to say, nope, enough's enough. And when I saw what it looked like a couple of months ago, I thought, not going anywhere near this. But I did it. I picked up a copy of Doctor Who, The Celestial Toymaker, the animated version, for better or for worse. Let's take a look at it. Okay, welcome back. It is now, in fact, 2 days later. As you can tell, I've got a different t-shirt on. And I've watched The Celestial Toymaker. I always think of it as The Celestial Toy Room for some reason. But it is, of course, The Celestial Toymaker. This is the latest BBC animated release, trying to fill in the gaps to those missing episodes that the BBC so foolishly destroyed back in the early 1970s. It's always galling to think that for the first 10 years of Doctor Who, pretty much every episode, bar maybe one or two, still existed. And of course, because of the BBC's policy of wiping tapes to reuse them, we are still missing so much classic Who from the 1960s. But the BBC are making efforts to try and fill the gap with these animations, and they're variable quality. I mean, I keep buying them, and I watch these things like the Macra Terror and Power of the Daleks, the Faceless Ones, stories I'm familiar with, broadly speaking. But I don't know them as well as I know stories from, say, the 70s or 80s that I've seen again and again. And possibly because I don't tend to revisit the animations because they don't give me that proper Doctor Who fix. And a lot of that is, of course, because they're animated. And when you've got actors like William Hartnell, and particularly Patrick Troughton was such a quirky visual actor who did lots of little things, and he's very facial, his movements and some of the little things he did. Just hard, if not impossible, to recapture, no matter how good the animation is. And of course, the animation for these Doctor Who things is low budget. They have to work within certain parameters. And I'm not blaming them for that fact. It's just that BBC Animation isn't Pixar. They don't have those facilities, they don't have those resources, so they do the best they can. And I've watched the animations, and I've got them all, and they're sort of enjoyable, but they're not things you go back to and watch again. So I was interested and intrigued by the Celestial Toymaker because we had a trailer for this last year. The animation is by Shapeshifter, which is an Australian motion capture animation studio, in conjunction with Big Finish Studios, who do the Doctor Who audios. I'm not a massive Big Finish fan. I don't listen to the audios. Big Finish have been doing Doctor Who audios for decades, well, since the late 90s. And they let's just say they fill a gap for Doctor Who fans who want classic type Doctor Who. And they go down all sorts of rabbit holes with continuity things and outrageous spin-off series, which is all well and good for people who like stuff like that. But I'm not a Big Finish person, particularly. Which is by the by, I suppose. This animation, then, we had a trailer last year, and I think a lot of people were sort of shocked by how bad it looked. It's a form of motion capture. I think Shapeshifter Studios tried this a couple of years ago when they animated part 3 of The Web of Fear, the missing Patrick Troughton episode. You will recall how back in 2013, all 6 episodes of The Web of Fear were apparently found. And then one of them, part 3, the crucial first appearance of Colonel Lethbridge Stewart, Nicholas Courtney, went missing somewhere between where it was found and back to the UK. It's never reappeared. It's still out there somewhere, presumably. So Shapeshifter animated it. And the animation, let's just say, isn't great. They've refined the process since then. About 3 years ago that came out, and they've refined it with better motion capture and better animation because technology is working that way. These things can look a lot better. But I think the trailer for Celestial Toymaker certainly annoyed a lot of fans. Certainly some high-profile fans who I won't name because you know who I'm talking about, who really did not like the look of this. And I can understand why, having seen that, because it looked like very blocky, very basic, almost like the 1980s computer animation. But having seen all 4 episodes of The Celestial Toymaker, I can see both sides of the argument. I can see people who think, actually, this is quite good. And I can understand the point of view of people who won't and can't tolerate it. It's an interesting thing with the animations because, of course, they are bringing to the screen missing episodes, missing stories. And the very fact that they're missing means that visual references thin on the ground. A lot of the 60s episodes had telesnaps that were taken by a chap called John Cura, who took photographs from the screen. So we have a visual record of lots of missing Doctor Who stories. But by the very nature of animating these things, what's the point in just recreating exactly what was on the screen on a tiny BBC budget in the 1960s with the paucity of visual effects that were available at the time? And I can understand the animators wanting to push the envelope out a little bit and do things slightly differently. One example that springs to mind is Fury from the Deep, the classic Patrick Troughton story, where an animated sequence of the Doctor in a helicopter was made much more exciting than it appeared on screen, where it was just the Doctor in a helicopter, by tentacles thrashing out of the foam and out of the water and sort of circling the helicopter. It just added a bit to it. That wouldn't have been done on screen. That couldn't have been done on screen at the time. They were able to do slightly different things. And I think if you're going to do that, if you're going to reinterpret a Doctor Who story, I can't think of one that's better suited to that than the Celestial Toymaker. This is the first on-screen battle between the Doctor and the villain who reappeared in The Giggle, one of the 60th anniversary stories last year. He's played by Neil Patrick Harris. Toymaker here is played by the great Michael Gough, one of the great character actors of the 50s and 60s. Appeared in so many B-movies, I suppose. Lots of TV shows. One of my favourite films of his is a ludicrous giant gorilla film called Conga, which was about 1962-63. Extraordinary film in so many ways. The Toymaker was due to reappear, in fact, in 1985-86 in that series of Doctor Who that was famously cancelled when the BBC axed the series briefly. There was a script and a story, and it was pretty far in advance in terms of pre-production, called The Nightmare Fair, which was written by former producer Graham Williams, which was going to be set in Blackpool, Doctor and Perry getting involved in another plot by the Toymaker, who I think would have been played by Michael Gough again. But of course that story never arrived. It was eventually novelised, and the Celestial Toymaker, now just renamed Toymaker, reappeared last year in The Giggle. This then takes us right back to 1965, the original serial. Only one episode exists, that's episode 4, The Final Test, which is on this new Blu-ray and it's been remastered. It looks very nice. The story itself, by its very nature, is wide open for reinterpretation and revisualization in a very 21st century way. And I can entirely understand why Shapeshifter and Big Finish decided to do that. Because as I think Gary Russell from Big Finish says in the making of, what would be the point in making a surreal fantasy Doctor Who story from the 1960s and trying to remake that in animation? Because the whole purpose of animation is to let you do something bigger and bolder, and this certainly does that. I watched the colour version of this and I actually quite enjoyed it. I think the animation falls into two stools for me. You've got the humanoid characters, you've got your Doctor, you've got his companions, Stephen, played by Peter Purves, and Dodo, played by Jackie Lane, and you've got the Toymaker himself, played by Michael Gough. They have been animated, I think, very well. Hartnell's a bit... It's hard to capture Hartnell, he's a bit caricature-ish, but I think Stephen, Dodo, and the Toymaker are quite well rendered. And they're quite well rendered to the extent that the motion capture they've used has allowed a lot more in the way of facial expressions. You know, Stephen in particular gets quite exasperated during the games, and you can see that on his face. And Dodo looking terrified and baffled and confused, and the Toymaker looking sinister. And that comes across in what they've been able to do with the faces. So I was quite impressed by that, and the movements are much more fluid than the animations, which are basically sort of Captain Pugwashy figures moving across the screen. It's much more fluid in terms of that sort of thing, that sort of movement and posture, and it works quite well. Of course, the TARDIS looks fantastic because that's something you can do so well in animation. And I think that part of it works well, certainly in terms of those characters. The other part of it, I think that also works well, but I think that's the part which people will be and are up in arms about, because everything else in the story is reinterpreted, or most of it. The story, as you know, I must tell you the story. Doctor, Stephen and Dodo pitch up in the domain of the Toymaker, a sort of a extra-dimensional terrain. I mean, we talk about Doctor Who dealing with the supernatural these days, but this was a sort of example of the show going into fantasy realms very early in its lifetime. They're trapped in this domain. The Toymaker, played by Gough, he forces the Doctor and his companions to participate in games to get back to the TARDIS and leave his domain. The Doctor is rendered invisible for 2 episodes, so William Hartnell can have a bit of a holiday, and the heavy lifting is done by Dodo and Stephen, who have to compete in these various games, toy room sort of games, floor games, card games. To be honest, even with the animation, a lot of the games are sort of hard to follow and they don't make a lot of sense. But the animation allows the animators to really express themselves and use their imaginations. And bearing in mind, I think there's not a lot of photo reference for the events in the episodes themselves. That's given them liberty to really go wild, if you like, and create psychedelic vistas and strange, unnerving, quite eerie sequences of the Toymaker looming over characters. And incidentally, that is something which we saw from Neil Patrick Harris in The Giggle. There were a couple of scenes, or one particular scene I'm thinking of, where he sort of appears as a giant figure looming over the Doctor. This isn't influenced by that, because I understand that this was in development for a couple of years before The Giggle was written, much less filmed. So it's a coincidence that that sort of appearance was given to the Toymaker in this as well as in The Giggle. And I think it works well as recreating that world, which they couldn't have done on screen. I mean, if you've seen the final test episode, it is very clumpy. It's very BBC Studios 1960s. And I understand the script had a number of rewrites. It was written by Brian Hales. It was substantially rewritten, I think, by the script editor and the producer to bring it back down to budget, to something that could be realised on a BBC budget. And it was very, very much reminiscent of a pantomime, if you've seen the episode of the final test with this character of Cyril, who is so obviously Billy Bunt, so I'm surprised the BBC didn't get sued for that even then. So it's all very psychedelic is the word I'm going to use it again. It's all very weird and very strange, with just whirling things and spinning things and things they couldn't have done in the 1960s. And I entirely understand why the animators wanted to do that now, because it's more imaginative for them, and for the viewer it gives a more modern experience. Certain issues with other characters, I mean, the other characters are largely played by 2 actors, Campbell Singer and Carmen Silvera, who play dolls and card versions of different characters. Their facial features haven't been recreated, which is a shame, because they were 2 great character actors. They're credited even in the credits of the animations, but you don't actually really see them, any version of them. There's maybe a sort of a military character in episode 3 who vaguely looks a bit like Campbell Singer, but generally they've gone the route of making these creatures look more eerie and more disturbing, I think, which really works quite well for the tone that we're going for in this. So all in all, before I actually give my view on the story, I think the animation it works for this story. I think if you were going to do another story, and I think there will be more animated stories, I'm not sure how it would work in a non-completely fantasy story. If I'm thinking of something like The Savages or The Highlanders, so a couple of other missing stories, whether this sort of animation will work in a more four-square and real situation. As I say, I think it works in this fantasy world because it allows the animators to express themselves visually, and it suits this story. So for me, it's a 50-50 thing. I quite like the realisation of the human characters. The rest of it is, because it's an expression of imagination, it doesn't sit well with the rest of it, but I can understand what they were going for. I understand why they did it, and I think it works in that context to create some quite weird stuff at times. There's an image of these dancing dolls coming out of a doorway at the end of episode 2 or 3, which is quite eerie. And the death of Cyril, when he gets electrocuted in episode 4, that's quite nasty. Much more nasty than it was when it was done on TV in the live version. So I think I genuinely approve of this as a story that had to be done in a different way to the way it was seen on screen, because the visual reference isn't there. Plus, if you're going to animate one of Doctor Who's most bizarre adventures, then be bold, be bizarre, and I think they've done that. But I'm not sure how this animation would work in a more traditional Doctor Who story. The problem with the story then, in short for me is the story. It's not really a very good story. It sort of lumbers along and it clunks. Of course, William Hartnell's out of the picture for a couple of episodes. I think Peter Purves and Jackie Lane carry it quite well, but it's just not a very interesting story. The Toymaker is great because Michael Gough really elevates it. He lifts what could have been a bit of a pantomime villain into something much more sinister. But I think as a story, it's very simplistic. It's very much a sort of a nursery story of games and dolls and childhood things. But it does bring with it the slightly darker aspects that you have of that sort of thing, that slightly eerie otherworldliness of those sorts of fairy tales and nursery rhymes and things like that. It sort of falls between two stools. I don't think it's a great story, basically, is what I'm trying to say. I think it's slightly sluggish and it's just a bit repetitive. Stephen and Dodo, as I say, carry the action and they're just playing a different game. They get foiled or they move on to the next one and they have a riddle to solve. And I just didn't find it hugely compelling. What kept it compelling for me was watching the animation in colour. And the colour is fantastic. I mean, it's really vivid, really pops out of the screen. I watched it on my projector screen. It looks great. It's also available in the black and white version. And of course, episode 4 is on there remastered. So I'm going to give the Celestial Toymaker as a story. We're looking at the story and the animation. I'm going to give it 6 out of 10. 6 out of 10. I think some people regard it as a classic Doctor Who story. I don't think it is. I think this sort of proves that it isn't really. It's a bit heavy going in places. But I think the animation lifts it. And it's interesting to see how they have chosen to interpret certain characters and certain sequences. In terms of special features, there's not a great deal here. There is a 73-minute feature, which seems to be something they filmed quite a lot of for forthcoming releases. And I can't say I relish the thought of watching them because I didn't watch this one. It's an escape room thing. It's called Escape Room Team First Doctor. And we can see from the title sequence of this that they filmed quite a lot with various characters from classic Doctor Who in this escape room scenario. Escape rooms were of no real interest to me. The only experience I have of one is a segment of the War of the Worlds live experience in London, where there's a sequence where you're in a room, you have to interpret clues and things. Doesn't appeal to me particularly. This features Peter Purves, Maureen O'Brien and Lisa Bowerman, who is a Big Finish regular. And it's hosted by Emily Cook, who is a Doctor Who magazine journalist and producer, and yeah, she's introduces this thing, but it's 73 minutes and I ain't wasting that much of my life on someone like that. So I skipped on that. I watched a few minutes but thought not for me. I said you got the remastered episode 4. There's a clip from an old VHS release, I think, with very young-looking Sylvester McCoy introducing the final episode. There's an audio interview with Carmen Silvera, and there are lots and lots of colour photographs. But as is pointed out in the making of, there's also a short making of, the photographs are just publicity photographs. They don't represent anything that happens in the story. They're just various photographs of Michael Gough and William Hartnell and Peter Purves and various characters. I don't know why they took so many publicity photographs for this thing. Maybe it's because Michael Gough was in it. There was a bit of a coup at the time. So that's the Celestial Toymaker, which is on Blu-ray and DVD and Steelbook now. An interesting experiment, and I think it works. As I said, it works for this story, but I'm not entirely sure this animation has a future in traditional Doctor Who adventures, which don't have this fantasy element to them. So that's it. It's out now. If you're interested in picking it up, do so and let me know what you thought of it. Leave a comment down below if you've bought this, what you think of it. If you're scandalised by what you've seen of the animation and you're going nowhere near it, let me know. And like and subscribe. That's another nice thing you could do. Like and subscribe to this channel, because there's a lot of Doctor Who content here. And that's something I am actually considering and thinking about a lot at the moment because of the way the channel has been going. There's been a lot of Doctor Who stuff. There will be a lot more Doctor Who stuff, and that seems to do quite well. It gets me new subscribers, it gets lots of views and comments, and I've noticed that other stuff doesn't. I mean, I did a retro movie review of The Princess Bride last week, which I don't think's got to 50 views yet, and yet Doctor Who reviews 300-400 views, sometimes more. So I need to have a think about what the channel is going to be and where it's going to go. I don't want it to be a Doctor Who channel because I've watched Doctor Who and commented on it, written about it all my life, and it's nice to have an outlet to talk about other things. But if people aren't watching those other things, then maybe I just need to stick to doing Doctor Who stuff. I don't really know. Let me know what you think. What do you think of this channel? What you'd like to see on it? Do you just want to see Doctor Who things? Do you want to see me doing retro movie reviews? Do you want to see me doing cinema reviews? Let me know, because, hey, this is your channel. I do it for you and me. So let me know what you think. Like and subscribe, leave a comment, blah, blah, blah. I'll see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.